Grand rotunda of the High Synod was not designed for silence, yet silence was the only thing that filled it now, heavy and suffocating like a physical weight pressing against the lungs of the 300 delegates gathered within. The chamber was a masterpiece of crystalline architecture, suspended in the upper atmosphere of the gas giant Othilla, surrounded by the swirling violet storms that had raged for 1 billion years, a testament to permanence in a galaxy that had suddenly become terrifyingly fragile. Light from the distant, dying sun filtered through the vast domed ceiling, casting long, pale shadows that stretched across the polished obsidian floor, making the delegates look less like living beings and more like statues erected in a graveyard. They were the leaders of the Concordat, the governing body of 1,000 star systems, representing species that had mastered faster-than-light travel, terraforming, and genetic manipulation. Yet in this moment, they were nothing more than frightened children waiting for the thunder. High Counselor Valen, a tall, slender being of the Ilari race, whose skin shimmered with the iridescent sheen of beetle wings, stood at the central podium, his many-jointed hands gripping the edges of the lectern until his knuckles turned a pale, stress-induced white. He looked out at the assembly, seeing the fear etched into the faces of the reptilian Crawl, the insectoid Xylanth, and the ethereal, gas-breathing Nymeans, and he knew that words were failing them all. The holographic tactical map floating in the center of the room told the story that no one wanted to vocalize. A sprawling three-dimensional representation of the galaxy where red icons were swallowing the blue ones with a hunger that seemed insatiable. A tide of violence that had begun cycles ago and had now reached the doorstep of the core worlds. The enemy was known as the Kravok, a species that the Concordat had once dismissed as primitive savages confined to the scorched irradiation zones of the galactic rim, a mistake that history would record as the final error of a dying civilization. The Kravok called themselves Wrath's Child, a title that the Concordat linguistic algorithms had initially translated as a poetic metaphor for their harsh upbringing on a volcanic world, but which had revealed itself to be a literal interpretation of their theology. They believed they were the divinely appointed scourges of the universe, bred to purify the weakness of peace through the fire of absolute conquest. They did not negotiate. They did not pause. They did not take prisoners. Their ships were jagged, brutal constructs of black iron and plasma fire, powered by engines that tore holes in the fabric of reality, leaving behind radioactive scars that poisoned star systems for generations. Valen watched the map as another blue light flickered and died, representing the fall of the Below system, a fortress world that had stood for 4,000 cycles, reduced to ash in a matter of hours. The silence in the chamber was broken by the shifting of robes and the low, mournful hum of the Nymean respirators, a sound that usually brought comfort but now sounded like a death rattle. General Korg of the Crawl, a massive warrior whose scales were scarred from a century of border skirmishes, stepped forward from the shadows of the lower tier, his heavy footsteps echoing like hammer strikes. "The 7th Fleet is gone," Korg said, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone present, devoid of the usual bluster and arrogance that characterized his species. "We have received the final transmission from Admiral Tyrok. He reported that the Kravok dreadnoughts simply walked through our shielding arrays as if they were mist. They are not slowing down, Counselor. They are accelerating." The kinetic calculations placed their vanguard within the Othilla sphere of influence within 3 standard rotations. "We have nowhere left to retreat. The Concordat is dead. We are merely the last nerves twitching in the corpse." Valen closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the despair wash over him before pushing it back behind the wall of discipline that his caste demanded. He knew Korg was right, but his role was not to mourn the dead, but to navigate the end. "We are not dead yet, General," Valen replied, though his voice lacked the conviction he desperately tried to project. "The archives speak of the Halo protocols, ancient defenses left by the precursors. If we can activate the dormant relay in the sector, we might be able to generate a hyperspace interdiction field strong enough to stall them." A ripple of uneasy murmuring moved through the crowd, a mix of skepticism and desperate hope, but it was cut short by the harsh, clicking laughter of the Xylanth ambassador, a creature of chitin and multifaceted eyes who sat perched on a suspended anti-gravity platform. "The precursors," the Xylanth hissed, its mandibles twitching Ithscorn myths, ghost stories told to hatchlings. "We have studied the relics for 1,000 years and found nothing but dust and dead code. You grasp at shadows while the blade is at your throat, Valen. The Kravok do not fear ghosts, they fear nothing. We should be discussing terms of surrender, not digging up graves." Valen's eyes snapped open, blazing with a sudden, cold intensity. "There is no surrender," he said softly, the quiet of his voice cutting through the noise more effectively than a shout. "We have seen what they do to those who surrender. They do not enslave, ambassador. They liquidate. They view existence other than their own as an insult to their gods. If we are to die, we will die standing, not begging." The debate raged on, a circular firing squad of blame and panic, as the red tide on the hologram crept closer, devouring the empty space between the rim and the sanctuary of Othilla. But Valen's mind was drifting, pulled away from the shouting matches and the strategic ineptitude of his peers, drawn toward a singular, nagging anomaly that had appeared on his private console only moments before the session began. It was a signal. Not from the Kravok, not from the desperate remnants of the Concordat fleets, and certainly not from the mythical precursors. It was a signal originating from a sector of space that had been quarantined by galactic law for 500,000 years, a region of the spiral arm known simply as the Silent Zone. The charts marked it as a navigational hazard, a graveyard of a species that had supposedly destroyed itself in a cataclysm of nuclear fire and biological hubris long before the Elari had even discovered the wheel. The species was called humanity. The legends of the humans were fragmented, contradictory, and terrifying. The archives described them as a paradox, a species of immense creativity and boundless aggression, capable of writing symphonies that could make a stone weep and inventing weapons that could boil oceans in the same breath. They had been short-lived, volatile, and utterly chaotic, expanding into the stars with a reckless abandon that terrified the older, slower races of the time. And then, abruptly, 500,000 years ago, they had vanished. Their worlds went silent. Their networks went dark. The prevailing theory among the Concordat historians was that they had finally crossed a line, unleashing a plague or an AI that had consumed them whole, leaving their systems as a radioactive monument to the dangers of unchecked ambition. No ship had entered the Silent Zone and returned. It was a void in the map, a place where the stars were said to be haunted. And yet the signal Valen was staring at was structured, rhythmic, and mathematical. It was a prime number sequence, encoded in a modulation that bypassed the standard subspace frequencies and resonated directly with the core of the station's oldest sensors. "Counselor Valen," General Korg's roar brought him back to the room. "You are distracted. The Kravok Vanguard has just breached the perimeter of the system. Their flagship, the Eater of Light, is charging its main weapon. We have less than one rotation before they are within firing range of the Synod itself. We must evacuate the leadership immediately." Valen looked at the general, then at the hologram, then down at the blinking light of the anomaly. A strange, irrational calm settled over him, the kind of clarity that comes to a condemned man when the executioner finally steps onto the platform. "There is no evacuation, General," Valen said, his voice steady. "Where would we go? The hyperlanes are mined. The relay network is compromised. If we flee, we die in the cold dark. If we stay, we die in the light of our own history." He tapped a sequence into the main console, overriding the tactical map and projecting the raw data of the anomaly onto the massive central display. The room gasped as the red tide of the Kravok was replaced by a spectral waveform, a pulsing, hypnotic blue line that danced across the air. "What is this?" the Xylanth ambassador demanded, its wings fluttering in agitation. "A sensor glitch. This is no time for astronomy, Valen." "It is not a glitch," Valen replied, stepping down from the podium and walking toward the center of the room. "It is a transmission from the Silent Zone, from Earth." The name hung in the air like a curse. The delegates exchanged glances of confusion and horror. Earth was a dead word, a synonym for extinction. "Impossible," Korg grunted. "The humans have been dust for 500,000 years. Even if they survived, they would be savages, degenerates picking through the rubble." "Or," Valen whispered, staring up at the pulsing blue line, "they have been waiting." The station shook violently, a tremor that ran through the floor plates and rattled the crystalline walls. The alarms screamed, a harsh, discordant wail that signaled a hull breach in the outer defense perimeter. The tact. Eichel map flickered back into existence, showing the Kravok fleet, hundreds of jagged black ships pouring into the system like a swarm of locusts. The Eater of Light, a vessel the size of a small moon, dominated the formation, its prow glowing with the sickly green energy of a planet cracker cannon. "They are here," Korg said, drawing his ceremonial plasma blade, though he knew it was a futile gesture. "Battle stations, all guards to the chamber doors." The delegates scrambled, panic finally taking total control, overturning tables and trampling over one another in a rush for the escape pods that would never launch. But Valen stood still, his eyes fixed on the anomaly data. The signal had changed. It was no longer a prime number sequence. It was a countdown, and it had reached 0. Space outside the great observation dome of the Synod, usually a velvet backdrop of stars and the swirling violet storms of Othilla, suddenly tore open. It was not the familiar blue swirl of a hyperspace window, nor the violent red tear of a Kravok warp jump. It was a silent, absolute negation of light. A fissure in reality appeared directly between the Kravok fleet and the defenseless station, a vertical gash of pure blackness that seemed to drink the light of the nearby stars. The panic in the chamber ceased instantly, replaced by a primal, frozen terror that affected even the Kravok, whose ships could be seen pausing in their advance, their sensors blinded by the sudden phenomenon. The fissure widened, stretching for thousands of kilometers, and from within the void, shapes began to emerge. They were not ships in the traditional sense. They were monoliths, great slabs of matte gray material that absorbed all radar and lidar scans, geometric and brutal in their simplicity. They did not have engines that glowed. They moved with a gravitational grace that defied inertia, sliding out of the tier in reality like swords being drawn from a sheath. There were no lights on their hulls, no windows, no visible weapon ports. They were silent, ghostly, and impossibly large. The lead vessel dwarfed the Kravok flagship, casting a shadow that eclipsed the entire Synod station. As the fleet fully emerged, dozens of these silent titans, the tier in space sealed shut behind them with a thunderclap that resonated through the vacuum, shaking the bones of everyone watching. What are they?" the Xylanth ambassador whispered, pressing itself flat against the floor. Valen felt a shiver run up his spine, a sensation that was not fear but awe. "The Wrath's child has come for war," he said, his voice trembling, "and the Ancient Ones have answered." On the bridge of the Eater of Light, High Warlord Grax stared at the viewscreen, his 4 eyes narrowing in confusion. He was a massive creature, encased in bioarmor that was fused to his flesh, a living weapon who had burned 1,000 worlds and never known hesitation. But this was new. "Analysis," he barked at his subcommanders. "Why are our sensors dark? Is it a nebula, a cloak?" "Negative, Warlord," the sensor officer replied, his voice laced with panic. "It is solid matter. Extremely dense, neutronium alloplating, but there are no energy signatures, no heat, no reactor output. They are dead ships." Grax sneered. "Dead ships or decoys, the weaklings of the Synod try to frighten us with statues, fire the main battery, vaporize the obstacle." The Eater of Light shuddered as its spinal mount cannon fired, unleashing a beam of concentrated plasma capable of cracking the tectonic plates of a habitable world. The green lance of energy streaked across the void, striking the center of the lead monolith. The delegates in the Synod flinched, expecting the explosion to blind them. But there was no explosion. The green beam hit the gray hull and simply vanished. It didn't deflect, it didn't absorb and heat up, it ceased to exist. The energy was nullified upon contact, as if the ship was not made of matter but of an event horizon. The beam sustained for 5 seconds, then sputtered and died as the Kravok capacitors drained. The gray monolith remained unmarked, untouched, hanging in the void like a judgment. Then the communications grid of every ship in the system, every console in the Synod, and every personal device was overridden. There was no static, no handshake protocol, just a sudden absolute clarity of audio. A voice spoke. It was not the guttural roar of the Kravok or the melodic trill of the Elari. It was a voice of calm, synthetic perfection, carrying an undertone of immense age and weary patience. It spoke in the trade tongue of the Concordat, but the accent was ancient, carrying the cadence of a language that hadn't been heard in 500,000 years. "We received your signal," the voice said. It was loud. Valen stepped closer to the console. "Identify yourself," he whispered, knowing the microphone would pick it up. "We are the Concordat. We are under attack by the Kravok." Are you the humans?" A pause. "Human," the voice mused as if tasting the word. "A label from our infancy. We have been many things since then, but yes, we are the children of Saul. We are the Terra-born." On the Kravok bridge, Grax roared in fury. "I do not care what you call yourselves. You stand in the path of the Wrath's child. Move or be unmade." "Wrath," the human voice replied, sounding almost disappointed. "We studied Wrath. We wore it like a coat for 10,000 years. We burned our own worlds with it. We poisoned our own blood with it. And in the end, we found it inefficient." The lead monolith began to change. The matte gray surface shifted, panels reconfiguring with fluid, liquid metal precision. A single aperture opened in the center of the vessel, not a weapon port, but something resembling a giant, glowing eye radiating a soft, golden light. "You call yourselves Wrath's child," the human voice continued, the volume rising slightly, filling the cockpits and chambers with a resonance that felt like a vibration in the bone. "You believe you are the apex of violence. You are children playing with matches in a library. We are the librarians, and we are telling you to be quiet." Grax slammed his fist on the command console. "All ships, full spread. Nuclear torpedoes, singularity charges, plasma lances. Fire everything. Burn them out of the sky." The Kravok fleet erupted. Thousands of missiles trailed fire across the dark. Hundreds of beams lit up the void. It was enough firepower to turn a solar system into dust. The attack wave surged toward the silent gray ships, a tsunami of destruction. Valen watched, holding his breath. The human ships did not move. They did not raise shields. Instead, the space around them seemed to fold. The missiles, upon reaching a certain radius, simply stopped. They didn't detonate. Their engines died. The warheads went inert. The plasma beams curved around the ships as if light itself was afraid to touch them, looping back into the void and dissipating harmlessly. The physical laws of the universe, momentum, combustion, energy transfer, seemed to be suspended by a higher authority within the vicinity of the Terran fleet. "We have mastered the strong nuclear force," the human voice explained, sounding like a professor lecturing a disruptive student. "We have mastered the manipulation of the Higgs field. Your weapons rely on the excitement of particles. We have simply calmed them down." The Kravok fleet drifted, their engines sputtering as the localized physics dampening field expanded. The Great Eater of Light went dark, its reactor reacting to the suppression field by shutting down to prevent a paradox. Warlord Grax stared at his dead screens, for the first time in his life feeling the cold grip of helplessness. "You have interrupted our sleep," the human voice said. "For 500,000 cycles, we have slumbered in the dark, conserving our energy, waiting for the entropy levels of the galaxy to stabilize. We withdrew to let you grow, to let you learn. We watched you, Concordat. We watched you, Kravok. We hoped you would find wisdom on your own." A small shuttle detached from the lead monolith. It was a sleek, silver teardrop, moving with impossible speed without any visible propulsion. It zipped past the drifting, powerless Kravok hulks and docked with the Synod Station's upper spire. "We are coming aboard," the voice said. "Prepare the chamber, we have much to discuss." The airlock of the High Synod hissed open, and the silence in the Grand Rotunda was absolute. The delegates, who had been cowering moments before, now stood in rows, drawn by a mixture of terror and curiosity. Valen stood at the front, flanked by General Korg, who still held his useless plasma blade but had the good sense to keep it lowered. Three figures walked through the mist of the decompression cycle. They were bipedal, possessing the basic symmetry that was common in the galaxy, but they were clearly far removed from the biological ancestors Valen had read about. They were tall, nearly 3 meters in height, encased in suits of white, articulated armor that looked less like metal and more like ceramic bone. Their faces were visible behind transparent visors, pale, hairless, with eyes that glowed with an internal luminescence. There was a sadness in those eyes, a depth of time that made Valen feel like an insect flickering in the span of a single day. The central figure removed its helmet with a hiss of gas. The face underneath was undeniably human, though refined, perfected, the skin flawless, the features symmetrical. He looked at Valen, then at Korg, then at the cowering ambassadors. "I am Keeper Thorn," the human said. His voice was not synthesized now, it was organic, rich, and quiet. "We apologize for the dramatic entrance, but your friends outside were being rude." You stopped them," Valen stammered. "You neutralized the entire Kravok armada without firing a shot, how?" Thorn smiled, a faint, weary expression. "When you live as long as we have, you learn that destruction is the easiest and clumsiest form of power. Anyone can break a glass. It takes a master to keep it from shattering when it falls. We simply removed the potential for violence from their local space. We turned off their ability to burn." General Korg stepped forward, his warrior instincts struggling against the overwhelming display of superiority. "If you have this power," he rumbled, "why did you hide? Why did you let the galaxy bleed for so long? The Kravok have slaughtered billions. Where was your ethics then?" Thorn turned to the giant reptile, his expression hardening slightly. "We are not your gods, General, nor are we your parents. We made a decision long ago after the Great Terran Wars. We realized that our interference stagnated the growth of younger species. If we solved your problems, you would never learn to solve them yourselves. We retreated to the silent zone to preserve the galaxy from us as much as to preserve us from you. We placed ourselves in stasis, observing, waiting. Waiting for what? The Xylanth ambassador chirped. For us to die. No, Thorn said softly. Waiting for the signal, not the signal you sent today, that was merely a trigger. We were waiting for a sign that the galaxy had matured enough to face the real threat. We hoped the Concordat would be that sign. We hoped you would unite against the Kravok. Instead, you bickered. You played politics while worlds burned. Thorn walked over to the tactical map, which was still displaying the frozen red dots of the Kravok fleet. He waved his hand and the map zoomed out past the Kravok territories, out past the silent zone, out past the rim of the galaxy itself. The Kravok call themselves Wrath's Child, Thorn said. They are a misguided, violent culture, yes, but they are running. Did you never ask yourselves why they were expanding so aggressively toward the core, why they were so desperate to secure resources? Valen frowned. We assumed it was conquest, lust for power. It was fear, Thorn corrected. The Kravok are not the invasion, they are the refugees. The map zoomed further, showing the intergalactic void between their galaxy and the next. There in the deep dark was a shadow, a sprawling, amorphous cloud that was slowly, inexorably moving toward them. It was not ships. It was not a nebula. It looked like a bruise on the face of the universe. We call it the entropy tide, Thorn said, the gravity of his tone dropping the temperature in the room. It is a cosmic anomaly, a remnant of a dead universe that hungers for order. It consumes energy, it consumes stars, it consumes consciousness. We fought it 500,000 years ago. We exhausted our civilization pushing it back. That is why we vanished. That is why we hid. We needed to heal. We needed to rebuild our fleets, refine our physics, and prepare for its return. The delegates stared at the screen, their petty squabbles about borders and trade routes suddenly rendered microscopic. The shadow on the screen was larger than their entire galaxy. The Kravok encountered the scouts of the tide on the rim, Thorn explained. They panicked. They tried to build a fortress galaxy by conquering everyone else, thinking that unity through subjugation would save them. They were wrong in their methods, but they were right about the danger. Valen felt his knees weaken. So, the Kravok were fleeing. Yes, Thorn said, and now the tide is here. The reason we woke up is not because you called us. It is because the sensors in the silent zone detected the tide crossing the galactic threshold. The war you thought you were fighting, Concordat versus Kravok, is a playground scuffle. The real war is about to begin. The human turned back to the assembly. We have neutralized the Kravok fleet, but we will not destroy them. We need them. We need their ships, their soldiers, their ferocity, and we need you. We need your logistics, your diplomacy, your diversity. The humans cannot fight the tide alone, not this time. You want us to ally with the monsters who burned our worlds? Korg asked, disbelief coloring his tone. I want you to survive, Thorn said simply. We will board the Kravok flagship. We will speak to Warlord Grax. We will show him what we showed you. We will offer him a choice. Join the coalition of life or remain frozen in the dark until the tide consumes him. I suspect he will choose life. Thorn looked at Valen. And you, High Counselor, we need the Synod to cease all hostilities. We need you to mobilize every resource, every scientist, every ship. We will provide the technology. We will provide the shields that can withstand the tide. But you must provide the will to fight. And if we refuse, the Xylanth asked. Thorn paused, looking at the alien with a mixture of pity and resolve. Then we will fight for you. We will die F. Or you if necessary, because that is what we do. We are the shield that guards the realms of men and by extension all sapient life. But make no mistake, without unity the galaxy will go quiet, and this time there will be no one left to wake up. The silence returned to the chamber, but it was different now. It was not the silence of despair, but the silence of a deep breath taken before a plunge. Valen looked at the hologram, at the terrified, frozen Kravok fleet, and then at the massive, godlike human ships hanging in the void, ready to stand between the galaxy and the dark. We are with you, Valen said, his voice ringing clear. The Concordat stands with Terra. Korg grunted, sheathing his blade. The Kralls stand with Terra. If these Kravok curs can fight, then let them fight beside us. Better to die biting the throat of a monster than hiding in a hole. Thorn nodded a slow, solemn gesture. Then let us begin. We have work to do. As the humans turned to leave, heading back to their shuttle to broker peace with the Kravok, Valen looked out the viewport. The violet storms of Othilla churned below, indifferent to the drama of biological life. But above, the black tier in space had vanished, replaced by the reassuring, solid presence of the Earth fleet. They were ancient, they were powerful, and they were terrifying. But for the first time in cycles, Valen felt something he hadn't realized he had lost. He felt safe. The humans had returned, and with them they brought the dawn of a new age, an age not of conquest, but of survival. The Wrath's child had been tamed, and the parents had come home. The galaxy would burn, yes, but it would burn with the fire of resistance, not the ash of extinction. And somewhere in the deep void, the entropy tide paused, sensing for the first time in eons a resistance that could not be simply devoured. It sensed the one thing the universe had learned to fear above all else: humanity, united and awake.